Hello and welcome to The Bottom Line on TVP World. This is where we unpack some of the main business and economic stories of the day. I'm your host, Marie Cato. Ukraine is still battling Russian aggression, but the EU, despite its vocal support for Ukraine and its reconstruction, is soon going to make importing Ukrainian foodstuffs more challenging. The details are a little complicated and beg the question, why right now? Let's go to Jan Michałek's feature report.
Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian food exports have benefited from a special duty-free agreement with the European Union. However, on June 6th, the so-called autonomous trade measures are set to expire, and the EU is now considering a return to pre-war tariff quotas. This comes amid growing unrest among European farmers, who argue that the influx of cheaper Ukrainian products has flooded the market and driven down prices.
The new measures introduced had and still have a huge impact for our agriculture. And there were some protests in Poland, in France, to protect the whole branch of our economy, which is agriculture.
Poland has been among the countries most affected by the inflow of cheap Ukrainian grain, prompting the former government to go against the EU by imposing its own restriction on Ukrainian imports.
Those special measures were introduced mostly due to the fact that we want to help the economy of Ukraine to grow. And right now, as is a difficult situation, as I said, because Commissions try to weigh on the risks of losing or sending the message to the world that we are left behind the Ukraine.
The Financial Times reports that until a new agreement is reached, reduced annual quotas will be implemented, which permit over 85% less maize, 30% less poultry, and just 1/3 of the previous sugar volumes. Ukrainian officials say that a return to the status quo would result in the country missing out on up to €3.5 billion. But experts argue that while the most convenient route for Ukrainian exports may soon be closed, other established routes remain available.
There is a chance that that Ukraine will find new markets, in fact, because still there is a strong partnership with Turkey, and also there is a partnership with African countries. So there are possibilities to do this for Ukraine in a fast way.
The European Commission wanted to have an updated trade deal with Ukraine ready by June 6th, but this has proven unrealistic. EC officials now expect the talks to conclude by October.
So the temporary trade rules set up after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine have become a point of contention with farmers around Europe and especially in Poland, complaining that cheaper Ukrainian foodstuffs are destroying their livelihoods. It's also not a coincidence that the rules are being changed before the presidential elections in Poland, which take place on Sunday. Lowering the tariff-free quotas quells farmers' discontent. To tell us about the significance of the EU's decisions, we are joined by Jan Michałek, Professor of Economic Sciences at the University of Warsaw. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So let's remind ourselves that the trade arrangements that the EU has had with Ukraine are temporary. And the perception is that perhaps this announcement, the timing of it, isn't ideal, or perhaps is it? What are your thoughts?
Yes, I would say it reflects, first of all, the difficulties in having a long-lasting agreement. We have to remember that the early agreement with Ukraine was signed in 2016, and this was so-called deep and comprehensive agreement. And in a way, it was quite similar to the other agreements concluded by EU with, for example, Eastern European countries. So it was speaking about the full liberalization of trade in industrial products, but a limited liberalization in agricultural products. Agriculture has always been very sensitive, and this was the most difficult I would say, element of the accession negotiations. So here the structure was the same, and then it was changed with the beginning of the war. I mean, in 22, in June, Europe decided to open the free trade for the Ukrainian agricultural products. And this was, of course, of big importance and big help to the Ukrainian agriculture. On the other hand, we witnessed some problems in the neighboring countries of Ukraine, and especially in Poland. It is true that the idea was that this wheat will flow through Poland, Hungary, and so on, to the more distant Asian and African countries. In practice, it became quite impossible to control the re-exportation, and the complaint was that in fact part of these deliveries are staying in Europe and lowering the prices.
So do you think it's high time, actually?
Yes, it is high time, but there are also some, I would say, institutional problems, in this sense that the common commercial policy is in the hands of the European Union. So it's rather not acceptable to impose individual bans on imports of some goods by individual countries. So there was a sort of, I would say, unease or tension between some Eastern European countries, including Poland, and the EU. So the question was, we should find a longer lasting solution. And the idea was that it was gradually liberalized over time. On the other hand, as we can understand, we don't know the details, there was, I would say, a restrictive approach by probably some Eastern European countries, being afraid that the inflow of the continuation of inflow of agricultural products might be harmful for the domestic industry. And therefore, in the political context, but also I believe in the context of, I would say, general disruption of tariff structures in the world related to the US policy, there was this decision that the imports should be limited.
Well, just speaking of details, because we know that for the rest of this year, Ukraine has access to this quota, 7/12 of this quota under the original 2017 DCFTA, which is the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area Agreement, and it applies to the sensitive products like poultry, eggs and maize. And what about other products?
Well, as I understand, the most sensitive products are, of course, wheat and maize. And here we see big cuts in terms of the duty-free quotas. We have to remember that the system operates like this, that in principle, there are some tariffs at the border of the EU. But then there are some open so-called import quota for which the tariff is much lower or equal to zero, which means that in real terms, the exports by the other countries are limited to the size of the quota. And of course, it might be more complicated if these quotas are subdivided by the countries or by the periods. It seems that this will be the case here as well. So it will be, in fact, quite restrictive for the Ukrainian exports.
But perhaps this might motivate Ukraine to reroute
yes,
products to other markets.
Yeah, I do understand this in the two-way side, that on the one hand, it should be a motivation to the Ukrainian delegation to speed up the process of negotiations, hopefully peaceful negotiations, and to reroute the exports of products by other, I would say, possible ways. On the other hand, I also hope that it will be an additional incentive for the EU trade policy to work on and continue to work on comprehensive, long-lasting free trade agreement. I would say it's also important because this will be an important experience for the future accession negotiations. We know, as I said, that agriculture was always very sensitive, and the major problem during the accession of Poland to the EU was the agriculture. We presume that here it will be the same. So this is just way in which I would say both sides are trying to find out what might be, you know, how it might work.
But in terms of agriculture and accession, Ukraine still has a long way to go in terms of standards.
Yeah. Yeah, but I would say this is something natural. So, I mean, just to remind you how it was in Poland, that on the one hand we had the negotiations accessions, and then we had the transitional period. So it was clear that during accession negotiations, the countries willing to accede should gradually adapt their legislation and their standards to the EU standards. And this is called law approximation and so on. And this is, I would say, a usual way. So I would say there is a time to adjust the, I would say, characteristics of Ukrainian products to the European market. But the question is how it can be, fit to be a reasonable and acceptable for both sides.
Absolutely. Do you think that Ukraine feels backstabbed with these announcements? Because there was a Ukrainian source that described these announcements as Trump methods in a velvet EU glove.
Yeah, I'm sure that Ukraine is not happy with this sort of restrictions. It has been, as it was been mentioned, it might limit the Ukrainian export by 3.5 billion of euro, which is quite a big amount of money. On the other hand, as I said, and as you said, it might be an additional incentive to think in a more realistic way about the accession negotiations and to think in a more, I would say, approaching way to the ongoing negotiation. I mean, to starting negotiations on peace. I hope it will happen.
In terms of the current rollback of these arrangements, it's estimated that it will cost Ukraine 3.5 billion euros annually. Do you think that this is a fair assessment? And what does it mean in terms of the anticipated reconstruction of the country?
Yeah, I mean, estimating the changes in the trade flows is not an easy task because we should know what is the elasticity of demand for imports and so on. Here, it is somehow simpler because we know what will be the size of imports limited by the size of quota. So I haven't seen the detailed, I would say, calculations, but I presume it is close to reality. Usually, this type of estimations are slightly overestimated to show the gravity of the problem. So this is my perception. And of course, I also hope that when the war will end and the reconstruction will start, this will be a new incentive to have new agreements. And knowing that now there is a chance for Ukrainians to have their own sources for reconstruction. So I do hope that Europe in this case will be much more relaxed. And I also think that there is a sort of alternative. I mean, to give more money in direct aid or to help more in importing the goods. So usually we believe, I mean the economists believe, that it is much better and much more efficient to have more trade and less aid than vice versa. So I hope it will go in this direction.
And to what extent do you think that Poland's presidency in the EU Council played a role in this, and the fact that we have the presidential elections later this week?
Yeah, these are the speculations. I presume, like in every speculation, there is a bit of truth. On the other hand, I would say that it is not a good situation, in my opinion, when this type of political and economic arguments are used during the campaign. Because in my opinion, I might be wrong, in fact, majority of the candidates are in favor of helping the Ukraine. So there is no big, I would say, distortion or no big discrepancy between their opinion. Of course, it might help the ruling parties to have a better position. But in my view, it should be used with calm and with I would say, delicate approach, if I may say so.
Well, we hear that Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said on Friday that Poland has finally managed to explain to other European partners that the liberalization of trade with Ukraine ruins not only Poland's market, but also other markets. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I hope this was a convincing discussion. But the truth is that there is only a single market in Europe. So once some goods are entering into the Polish or other market, they can spread over all Europe. So in this sense, if there is a price pressure from the cheaper goods coming from abroad, it might have long lasting and spreading the implications. I must say, always a little bit afraid when I'm listening to the argument that foreign trade is ruining some, I would say, parts of the population. In my view, it's the nature of competition. Of course, we can say a fair competition. That this competition is frequently forcing companies, farmers, to think what should be produced, to think how it can be more efficiently produced, and so on and so on. On the one hand. On the other hand, if we look at the European market, it's clear that there have been some, I would say, major producers, and namely France and Poland, who have been for many years fighting for, I would say, closed European agriculture market, knowing that being the major producer and selling the goods at a much higher than the world prices is beneficial for the local farmers. So this is nothing strange. We have also to remember that the common agriculture policy was in fact invented by France in 1961-62, just to have the isolated market from the rest of the world and to be able to sell French products domestically. So the situation is not very different from what it was, I would say, half a century ago.
But how would you, in that case, explain to the average local Polish farmer the frustration that they've been experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to explain, but I would say what was a fantastic experience of Polish society, that when the war started, whole society tried to help in many ways. I mean, people giving money, food, clothing, homes, and so on. It was touching everyone. I mean, at the university, we had the inflow of Ukrainian students trying to help them and so on. So I would say this is something which has happened to this society, revealing that this society is ready to sacrifice a bit in order to help the neighbors in their, I would say, right case. And there is a, I would say, cost-benefit analysis. It is not that we are only helping Ukrainians. Ukraine is helping the whole Europe to defend against the, I would say, quite brutal expansion. So, I mean, maybe there is a case rather for the government to think in which way, if there is severe frustration and if there are severe financial losses, how to compensate the farmers from this loss. This is, in fact, usually the instrument used by the common agriculture policy, that if some farmers, like, let's say, in the 90s, were suffering from lowering the intervention price, then they were direct payments paid to the agricultural farmers for compensating them the lower prices and lower incomes. So I do hope that there is a room for finding a solution to compensate somehow the domestic farmers and to have a viable liberalizing agreement with the Ukrainian economy.
Okay,
I am quite optimistic.
You are very optimistic. Jan Michałek, Professor of Economic Science at the University of Warsaw, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And that concludes The Bottom Line today. I was your host, Marie Cato. We're on every weekday at 5:10 CET on TVP World. And in the meantime, for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. And for more news and analysis, stay with us on TVP World. Goodbye.